Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I'm joined by Christoph.
Hey, it's
Much
me,
bigger
Christoph.
vocabulary than I do.
That is to be, yes, probably, I don't know. I bet you know more swear words. You being a Navy guy and all.
Well, we try to keep this family friendly, so I will not be going through them here.
Don't sell yourself short. I bet you could teach me many things and the audience, but I appreciate the self-restraint.
When we talk about the Battle of Badung Strait, it is tempting to treat it as a small, almost obscure night action. A clash of destroyers in dark, tropical waters. But to the men who sailed into that strait in February of 1942, it did not feel small. It felt like the edge of a collapsing world. To understand why Allied ships were racing towards Bali that month, we have to widen the lens. We have to go back to December of 1941 and the opening shockwaves of the Pacific War. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Japan launched coordinated offensives across the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia. The assault was not a single blow. It was a rolling tide. In rapid succession, Japanese forces struck the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, and Wake Island. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, on December 10th, 1941, Japanese land-based torpedo bombers sank the British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse off the coast of Malaya. It was a seismic moment. 2 capital ships, symbols of imperial naval power, destroyed by aircraft operating from land bases. The message was unmistakable. Air superiority would define the coming campaign. As January 1942 unfolded, Japanese forces advanced southward with startling speed. Malaya fell. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, would soon follow. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces were pushed back towards Bataan and Corregidor. At the center of this tightening noose lay the Netherlands East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. A vast archipelago, rich in oil, rubber, tin, and strategic sea lanes. For Japan, the oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra were essential. The American oil embargo imposed in 1941 had cut Japan off from its primary fuel supply. Securing the resources of the Netherlands East Indies was a strategic imperative. For the Allies, those same islands represented both a shield and a lifeline. If Japan controlled them, it would gain access to critical resources and dominate the maritime crossroads between the Pacific and Indian Oceans. In January 1942, the Allies attempted to organize a united defense. The result was ABDA Command, the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command. Its naval forces were placed under the command of Dutch Rear Admiral Karl Doorman. On paper, ABDA looked formidable. In reality, it was a patchwork force. American cruisers and destroyers, British ships, Dutch vessels, and a handful of Australian warships, all operating with different doctrines, communication systems, and tactical habits. They shared a common enemy, but not a common language of war. Japan, by contrast, had spent years refining night fighting doctrine. Their destroyer crews trained relentlessly in torpedo tactics. Their Type 93 torpedo, later nicknamed the Long Lance, had extraordinary range and sinking power, and they moved with operational cohesion. By early February 1942, Japanese forces had already taken key positions across the region. They seized airfields and established forward bases. Allied naval movements were increasingly exposed to land-based Japanese aircraft. And then the focus shifted to Bali. At first glance, Bali might seem peripheral compared to Java or Sumatra. But geography is destiny. Bali sits just east of Java. On Bali's southern coast lays Denpasar Airfield. If Japanese forces captured that airfield, they would be able to base aircraft within easy range of eastern Java. Allied ships attempting to defend Java would be operating under constant aerial threat. The noose would tighten further. By mid-February, Japanese moved decisively. An invasion convoy was assembled to land troops on Bali. The convoy was not massive. This was sufficient. Troops, transports, and destroyer escorts would move in, land forces, and secure the airfield. The Allied High Command knew that if Bali fell uncontested, the defense of Java would become dramatically more difficult. But here's the critical reality. By February 1942, the Allies were reacting, not dictating. Their intelligence picture was incomplete. Their air power was limited. Their ships were dispersed, often low on fuel and operating from vulnerable bases. There was also the psychological factor. Imagine serving a U.S. Navy destroyer in early 1942. You have heard about Pearl Harbor. You have heard about the loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse. You know that Wake Island has fallen. The Philippines are under siege. Reports filter in of Japanese forces advancing almost everywhere they strike. There is a growing, unspoken question. Can we stop them? For Dutch sailors, the stakes were even more personal. The Netherlands itself had fallen to Germany in 1940. Now their colonial homeland was under direct threat. The Netherlands, East Indies represented not just territory, but national survival, economic lifeblood, and honor. Rear Admiral Dorman faced an enviable task. He did not have enough ships. He did not have air superiority. And yet he was expected to contest every Japanese move. When news arrived that Japanese forces were moving on Bali, there was little time for deliberation. The decision was made to strike back, to send Allied surface forces into the confined waters of the Badung to disrupt the landing. It would be a nighttime operation. Speed and surprise would have to compensate for weakness. In many ways, the Battle of Badung Strait was born not out of strength, but out of necessity. It was an act of resistance during a campaign defined by retreat. As Allied ships began preparing to sortie towards Bali in February 1942, they carried with them more than ammunition and fuel. They carried the weight of a collapsing defensive perimeter. They carried the hope that a sharp blow in the darkness might slow the Japanese advance. The invasion convoy was approaching Bali. The airfield hung in the balance. And in the warm waters between Bali and Java, a narrow strait would soon become the setting for one of the first desperate surface clashes of the Allied naval war in the Pacific.
I'm going to start by saying I know very little, close to nothing about what you're talking about, with the exception of Japan was taking stuff over in the Far East, including island chains, Wake Island, Indonesia, things like that. I knew the Americans, amongst other allies, were fighting them. And that's kind of it. And I know where Indonesia is. When you mentioned the ABDA coalition, America, British, Dutch, Australian, that's ABDA. I added Canada, Argentina, Denmark, Andorra, Bhutan, and Antarctica. Anyway, I know that this is a very resource-rich area, and Japan was hurting with that oil embargo. And if they're going to fund their war and power their war machine, they need to get resources. And so this is an attempt to secure all that. From a high level, that's what I'm aware of. That's what I know that they're trying to do by taking over so much territory and be the power in this sphere. Of course, A lot of other places have claimed this territory, such as the Dutch and the British. And so we're at war. So I'm curious to see how it unfolds and also what the relevant parts are. Because, like I said, I don't know the details about the specific geography about I think you said like the Badung Strait, or I've only heard of the city of Denspar. I've only just read it once or maybe twice. So yeah, I'm very curious how this unfolds and how it impacts the greater conflict.
The invasion convoy was approaching Bali. The airfield at Denspar hung in the balance. And events began to move with unsettling speed. In mid-February 1942, Japanese planners put into motion a tightly coordinated operation to seize Bali. This was part of the larger offensive sweeping through the Netherlands East Indies, a deliberate effort to isolate Java before the main blow fell. The landing force assigned to Bali was built around elements of the Japanese 48th Infantry Division, veterans of earlier operations in the Philippines. They had already seen combat. They understood amphibious landings. They moved with discipline and confidence. Their transports were escorted by a small but capable screen of destroyers from the Imperial Japanese Navy. These ships were lean, fast, and commanded by officers trained extensively in night combat. Though the escort force was not overwhelming in size, it did not need to be. At this stage in the campaign, Japanese commanders calculated correctly that Allied resistance would be fragmented and reactive. The convoy departed under the protective umbrella of Japanese air superiority. By February 1942, land-based aircraft operating from captured airfields in Borneo, Allied air reconnaissance was sporadic and vulnerable. Every daylight movement by Allied ships risked attack from above. As the convoy steamed southwest towards Bali, the Allied command structure struggled to piece together reliable intelligence. Reports filtered in, sightings of enemy transports, estimates of troop strength, guesses about timing, but fog and distance clouded the picture. By February 18th, Japanese forces were approaching the southeastern coast of Bali. Their objective was clear: land troops near Sanur, and seize Denspar airfield before meaningful resistance could organize. The landing itself began in the early hours of February 19th, 1942. In the darkness before dawn, Japanese troops began disembarking from transports onto Bali's shores. There was little serious opposition. Dutch colonial defenses on the island were thin and poorly equipped. Some local resistance occurred, and Dutch forces attempted to contest the landing, but they lacked heavy weapons, air support, and numbers. The momentum belonged entirely to the invaders. Within hours, Japanese troops pushed inland. Their objective was not to occupy every corner of Bali immediately. It was to secure the airfield. Once aircraft could operate from that runway, the strategic geometry of the region would change overnight. And that is precisely what began to happen. Even before Allied naval forces could respond, Japanese engineers and advanced elements were preparing the airfield for immediate use. Aircraft would soon be able to launch from Bali and strike targets across eastern Java and the surrounding waters. This was the nightmare scenario they had feared. News of the landing reached ABDA headquarters quickly, but clarity did not accompany urgency. Rear Admiral Dorman understood that allowing the Japanese to consolidate their hold on Bali without contest would accelerate the encirclement of Java. But what could he send? East Indies was a fragile mosaic. Fuel shortages, limited range, air cover was minimal. Communications between American, Dutch, British, and Australian units required careful coordination. And time was precisely what they did not have. Still, inaction was not an option. Orders went out for available surface units to prepare for an immediate counterattack. The plan was simple in concept and difficult in execution. Send destroyers and cruisers into the Badung Strait under cover of darkness. Strike at the Japanese transports and escorts, and disrupt the landing force before it could fully entrench. But already the clock was against them. By the time Allied ships could reach the area, Japanese troops were ashore. The airfield was either secured or on the verge of falling. The element of surprise had slipped away. Meanwhile, the Japanese escort force adjusted its posture. Once the troops were landed, the destroyers did not immediately withdraw. Several remained in the vicinity to guard the anchorage and ensure that no Allied force could approach unchallenged. This decision reflected Japanese confidence and discipline. Rather than scatter, they prepared to meet any counterstroke head-on. The waters of the Badung Strait added another layer of complexity. The strait is relatively narrow, hemmed in by Bali to the east and Java to the west. Tidal currents can be swift. In 1942, detailed hydrographic knowledge among Allied crews was limited. Night navigation in confined waters carries risk. The possibility of grounding, collision, or misidentification. This was precisely where Allied ships would have to fight. By late February 19th, the situation had crystallized. Japanese troops were ashore. Denspar Airfield was effectively in enemy hands. Japanese destroyers patrolled nearby waters. Allied forces were assembling in separate groups, racing against time and distance. There is a particular tension in moments like this, when commanders know that events are slipping beyond their control, but still choose to act. For the officers aboard the approaching Allied destroyers, their mission was stark. They would steam enemy-held waters at night, with limited air reconnaissance, uncertain intelligence, and no guarantee of mutual support from other Allied groups. They were not sailing into a vacuum. They were sailing towards an enemy who had just demonstrated operational superiority across the region. And yet, there was resolve. The counterattack on Bali would not reverse the tide of the campaign. No one harbored illusions about that, but it might slow it. It might damage transports. It might buy time for Java's defenses. As darkness fell over the waters between Bali and Java on February 19th, 1942, the invasion convoy had done its job. Troops were ashore. The airfield was slipping into Japanese control. Now the question was whether the Allies could strike back in time to make a difference. In the narrow channel of the Badung Strait, the first moves had been made. The next would be taken in darkness, by ships closing on each other at high speed, guided by training, instinct, and the thin threads of communication that held a multinational fleet together.
So, while you were speaking, and I hope the listener does this also, while you were speaking and listing the places, I said, you know what, I don't know about that geography. I'm going to look it up. So I checked the map, looked up Bali, Denspar, Indonesia, where they are relative to Japan and Australia. It's an island chain that looks like broad barrier between Southeast Asia and Australia. So you'd have Indonesia on top of the Philippines. It's a collection of numerous islands. I'm curious about why they had to go through that strait when there are so many alternate sea routes. And again, that just is probably just proclaiming my ignorance of the geography. Maybe that is the easiest path based on reefs or any other sandbars strategically located and highly defensible. So taking this airfield, you can hit so many different things, and supply would be a lot easier, and disruption of different ships going to supply the Allies. The more I look at it geographically and what the terrain is like, this is a really wise and strategic move by the Japanese from an amoral position. Strategically, the Dutch were invaded by the Germans for the entirety of World War II. So their homeland is gone, or not their outlying territories like Curacao, the Dutch East Indies, are in Dutch hands, and they are extra motivated to try to repel enemies of their nation. They are not well supplied. They don't have the firepower. They don't have the manpower. They have no air power to speak of. Yet, the resolve that they have, along with other allied assets in the area, to try to slow this advance, to try to deny the Japanese this prize, is incredible. Like when you see what they're up against, and yet they don't fold. They still persist and they still try. I'm nervous to hear how this unfolds because I have an idea. It just makes me feel good. It makes me feel like there are people out there that know what the fight is about, know when to step up, and they do it because it's the right thing to do, regardless of what the possible downside will be.
In the narrow channel of the Badung Strait, the first moves had been made. The next would be taken in darkness, by ships closing on each other at high speed, guided by training, instinct, and the thin threads of communication that held a multinational fleet together. But before the guns could fire, before torpedoes could be launched into black water, there was a question of how to respond. And the Allied naval force in the Netherlands, East Indies in February 1942 was not a unified fleet in the traditional sense. It was an emergency coalition assembled under pressure, a maritime patchwork stitched together in the face of a relentless Japanese advance. Stood Rear Admiral Karl Doorman of the Royal Netherlands Navy. As commander of the naval component of ABDA Command, he carried responsibility for coordinating American, British, Dutch, and Australian warships, each with its own command structure, tactical doctrine, and communications procedures. Doorman spent decades in naval service, but nothing in peacetime exercises could fully prepare a commander for this, a rapidly collapsing theater, incomplete intelligence, air inferiority, and the constant demand to act despite unfavorable odds. When reports confirmed the Japanese landing at Bali and the imminent loss of the airfield, Doorman knew delay would only worsen the situation. Japanese aircraft operating from Bali would soon dominate the eastern approaches to Java. Allied ships moving in daylight would be exposed. The window for a surface counterattack was narrowing. The difficulty lay not only in the enemy's strength, but in the Allies' dispersion. Available ships were scattered across ports and patrol areas. Fuel shortages constrained movement. Mechanical reliability was uneven. Some vessels had already seen heavy action in earlier engagements. Others were newly arrived and still acclimating to local conditions. Circumstances dictated that Allied ships would approach Bali in separate groups. One striking element consisted primarily of United States Navy destroyers. Modern ships, well handled, but operating far from their home waters. These included vessels of the Clemson class, lean, flush-deck destroyers designed during the First World War, but still forming the backbone of American destroyer forces in the early Pacific War. Their crews were professional and disciplined, but many had not yet fought a major surface engagement against Japanese forces. Navy's night tactics was limited. A second element included Dutch light cruisers and destroyers. These ships carried the weight of national expectation. The Netherlands East Indies was not a distant colony in abstract geopolitical terms. It was the last major bastion of Dutch sovereignty after the German occupation of the Netherlands in 1940. For Dutch sailors, the defense of Java and its surrounding islands were not merely strategic, it was personal. Coordinating these two elements was complicated by timing and geography. The ships were not all in the same port. They would not arrive in this area simultaneously. Instead, they would converge or attempt to under cover of darkness. entering the confined waters of the Badung Strait. This fragmentation was not ideal. Concentration of force had been a core naval principle for centuries, but in February 1942, ideal conditions were a luxury, no longer available. Communication posed another challenge. American and Dutch ships used different signal procedures. Radio discipline was essential to avoid detection, yet silence limited coordination. Visual signaling at night was fraught with risk. Recognition errors in darkness could be fatal. In addition, the Allies lacked effective radar integration. Some American destroyers were equipped with early radar sets, but these systems were still primitive by later war standards. Range resolution was limited. Night combat was still evolving. Dutch vessels had more limited electronic capability. By contrast, Japanese destroyer crews were highly trained in optical night fighting. They drilled extensively in torpedo attacks conducted at long range in darkness. Their doctrine emphasized surprise, coordination, and decisive strikes. All of this meant that as Allied ships prepared to sortie towards Bali on February 19, 1942, they were sailing into a contest where the enemy possessed structural advantages in training doctrine, even if the numerical balance at certain moments might favor the Allies. And yet, there was resolve. On the bridges of these ships, captains and officers studied charts of the Badung Strait. They traced courses through narrow waters. They calculated estimated positions of Japanese escorts and transports. They weighed speed against caution. The mission offered both opportunity and risk. Destroyers were built for aggressive action, for torpedo attacks, for close engagements. In the confined waters of the strait, they could maneuver quickly, strike, and withdraw. But they would be operating at night, in waters where enemy ships might be equally close and equally aggressive. For the Dutch commanders, the stakes were sharpened by urgency. If the Japanese could be disrupted at Bali, perhaps the advance towards Java could be slowed. Perhaps Allied morale, battered by weeks of setbacks, could be steadied by a sharp counterblow. There was no guarantee of success. There was no illusion of overwhelming superiority. What existed instead was determination. Determination to contest every landing. Determination to demonstrate that the Netherlands East Indies would not be surrendered without resistance. Determination, even in retreat, to impose cost on the advancing enemy. As the first Allied destroyers cleared harbor and turned southward towards Bali, the crews understood that this would not be a daylight engagement fought at comfortable range. It would be close, fast, and confusing. In the hours ahead, formations would stretch and compress in darkness. Lookouts would strain their eyes against black horizons. Orders would be shouted into wind and engine noise. Torpedo tubes would be trained on fleeting silhouettes. The Allies' response to the invasion of Bali was fragmented, shaped by fuel, timing, and distance, but it was also determined, and the ships were underway. And in the warm night waters of the Badung Strait, the first confrontation between Allied surface forces and Japanese escorts was about to unfold.
Oh man, this is where it happens. I got some questions. Before I get to them, I want to remind myself and the listener that this is February of 1942, just months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. December 1941, just a few months later, America is just starting out. We're joining an effort that a lot of other countries have been involved with, because as soon as Japan noticed that, oh, there's a big fight over there in Europe, we're going to take all these colonies from them to get resources. And so they declared war on effectively all the European countries that were not Germany, and I suppose Italy as well. I don't know if Italy had any in Southeast Asia, Oceania area. Anyway, so America is just coming in, and we need to communicate with folks that English is not their first language. So when you mentioned the ABDA campaign, Aussies, British, speak English, no problem, but the Dutch, that's fascinating to me. How do you coordinate this, especially when this is their turf, and that's primarily the people with whom you need to speak? Well, this leads to my question to you. As a television watcher in my youth, watching the news, and they would talk about how the military is conducting training drills with, and then list the allies they're conducting it with. Sometimes the British, sometimes the Australians, sometimes the French, but various folks. How do you communicate when it is with a country, like let's say you're coordinating with Brazil? Portuguese is very different. Probably not a lot of American sailors speak it. Do everybody just communicates in English on the sea or some other language? Or what is the protocol? Or is that top secret and I'm not allowed to know? Because I will accept that as an answer.
I was a machinist mate. I was not in communications.
Okay.
So my expertise is not in communications at sea. But
the perfect cover to not answer the question.
I'm going to answer the question.
Okay.
World War II was the first big test of coordinating multinational operations. We had a taste of that in World War I, but everybody still kept to themselves for the most part, right?
Yeah.
World War II, though, is when we started seeing coalitions starting to form. So this is where communications had to start being worked out. Now we have communication systems that we've worked out with our partner countries.
Right.
Whether it is a single language or whether it is a universal for language or universal coded language used with the lights and things of that nature. I don't know for sure what that evolution looks like, but this is where all that starts.
You did mention earlier that there wasn't alignment on the signaling between the different nationalities and their ships. I was holding my hands on my head like, oh my gosh, what a disaster that's about to be. Because you're saying one thing and it could be a simple, hey, we're going to do this, or what are you going to do, or some simple form of communication, and it can get totally garbled, and you can make a wrong decision based on information you think is right but is not. So I'm sure many lessons were learned from a broader perspective of working with allies around the globe trying to accomplish anything.
Also remember, we're still in a time where lots of people knew multiple languages.
That's true. I keep forgetting that. I think nowadays we get reports about who's listening to this podcast from a nationality perspective, and it's all over the globe, and I'm like, what's an Italian doing listening to me? How do they understand me? And it's like, oh no, they speak English. English is de facto the language of business today. And so it's kind of the international language, similar to how French was at one point. And then I suppose Latin and Greek were at some point also. So as somebody born in an English-speaking country, it's not a priority as much to learn an alternate language. It's more of a nice to have. But yeah, I totally get where you're coming from. A lot of people spoke multiple languages at this time.
The ships were underway, and in the warm night waters of the Badung Strait, the first confrontation between Allied surface forces and Japanese escorts was about to unfold. By the evening of February 19th, 1942, the first Allied striking group, a division of United States Navy destroyers, was closing on Bali from the south. Their orders were direct. Enter the Badung Strait under cover of darkness. Locate the Japanese landing force and strike. The night was thick and moonless. Tropical humidity hung low over the water. Visibility shifted with passing clouds. In confined waters, distance could be deceptive. A shadow might be a coastline, or it might be an enemy ship. The American destroyers advanced in column formation, driving them at high speed. These were cleansed, long, lean, and fast. Built in the final months of the First World War, they were not glamorous, but they were agile. Their primary offensive weapon was the torpedo. If they could close to effective range and launch a coordinated spread, they might cripple transports or even the escorting destroyers. Captains leaned over charts illuminated by dim red lights. Bearings were checked and rechecked. The coastline of Bali loomed to the east. Java lay to the west. The strait between them narrowed ahead. Some destroyers were equipped with early radar sets, primitive by later standards, but still a potential advantage. Operators stared at flickering scopes, trying to distinguish land echoes from moving contacts. The technology was new, the interpretation still as much art as science. Shortly before midnight, the first signs of the enemy began to emerge. Japanese destroyers, assigned to protect the landing force, were still in the area. Their transports had already completed much of the unloading, but the escorts remained vigilant. Japanese commanders understood that a nighttime counterattack was likely. Their ships were patrolling, alert for silhouettes against the horizon. The Americans entered the strait at high speed. The engagement unfolded in uncertainty. Shapes appeared and vanished in the darkness. Reports moved from lookout to bridge in rapid succession. There was no time for extended confirmation. In night combat, hesitation could be fatal. The American destroyers maneuvered aggressively, attempting to close the range and bring their torpedoes into position. The plan was straightforward: launch, then turn away before the enemy could respond effectively. Torpedo tubes were trained. Compressed air systems were checked. Orders were relayed down the line. Then, in the darkness, the first American torpedoes slipped into the water. They ran invisible and deadly, leaving only faint wakes in the sea. Each carried a substantial warhead. If one found its target, it could shatter a destroyer or cripple a transport. But combat is a contest of margins. Japanese escorts detected the approaching threat almost simultaneously. Lookouts spotted muzzle flashes and silhouettes. Japanese destroyers began evasive maneuvers, turning sharply to comb potential torpedo tracks. Moments later, the strait erupted in gunfire. Bright flashes split the darkness as 5-inch guns opened up. Tracers arced low over the water. The sudden illumination transformed black silhouettes into stark outlines. Ships, now visible, but only in flashes. American destroyers maneuvered hard, their helmsmen executing sharp turns fire. Spray lashed over decks as ships cut through narrow waters at speed. The torpedo salvos, however, did not produce decisive results, whether due to misjudged range, evasive Japanese maneuvering, or the inherent uncertainties of nighttime firing solutions. The American torpedoes failed to score confirmed hits. It was an ominous sign, one that would echo in future engagements. Early war American torpedo performance, plagued by reliability and depth control issues, was not yet fully understood. But on this night, the absence of explosions spoke volumes. The Japanese destroyers responded with discipline and aggression. Their gunners were well trained in night engagements. Shell splashes rose dangerously close to American hulls. One destroyer sustained damage from near misses and splinters. Another reported hits that temporarily disrupted systems, but did not disable the ship. In confined waters, the engagement compressed quickly. Ships that had been distant shapes moments before were now exchanging fire at relatively close range. The Americans pressed the attack as long as conditions allowed. Additional torpedoes were fired. Gunfire continued, but the tactical situation was not developing in their favor. Without confirmed torpedo hits and facing organized resistance, the American commanders faced a hard choice: withdraw and preserve their ships for future action. Fuel levels and the broader strategic situation weighed heavily. These destroyers were precious assets in a shrinking fleet. Losing them in a narrow strait without decisive gain would further weaken Java's defense. Gradually, the order was given to disengage. Under cover of darkness and smoke, the American destroyers increased speed and began to withdraw southward, leaving behind the anchored invasion force they had hoped to disrupt. The first Allied attack at Badung Strait had been bold, aggressive, and ultimately inconclusive. The Japanese landing at Bali remained intact. The airfield was still in enemy hands. The escorting destroyers, though shaken, had held their ground. Yet, the night was far from over. Even as the American destroyers withdrew, another Allied group was approaching. Dutch cruisers and destroyers, determined to press the fight further. The first clash had revealed hard truths. Torpedoes could miss. Darkness favored the well-trained, and the Japanese escorts were neither surprised nor easily broken. But for the Allies, retreat did not mean surrender. The battle was only beginning.
Oh, that's crazy. The thing that kept circling in my mind as you were unfolding the story was the training that the Japanese undertook with regards to fighting and observing at night. And when you drill something, it just becomes second nature. And so in this conflict, in this contest here, they had the supreme advantage because this is before radar, relying a lot on visual observation. When they launched the torpedoes, they could have miscalculated the distance, and that may have been why they failed. And so you're doing a lot with older methods and technology that make it a lot more difficult. A lot of these problems get resolved in the period of World War II because the technology gets developed. Like when we talked previously about submarines, depth charges come about to fight submarines or better air reconnaissance. And same thing here. What do you do when it's foggy or dark or everybody's running quiet or dark themselves? Things like radar help. Just as you integrate more technology into your weapons and observation systems, it resolves a lot of these issues. Given that Japan had superior firepower, manpower, training, and knowledge of the local waters versus Americans in particular, and a resolve that its reputation speaks for itself, it just is incredible. This was almost a done deal. Japan was going to be successful. This coalition that's just trying to get stuff together is able to slow them down, is able to show resolve, like you said. What may look like a failure with the withdrawal, these are lessons. It's like, okay, this didn't work. Let's see what we can learn from this and then ultimately adapt and over time be successful. Allies win in World War II. Ultimately, the Allies win, but in the beginning, that was not clear. This was tense. This was a hard fight against a hard enemy, and we did not start really having significant gains until maybe mid-1942, maybe, from a naval perspective, and in the Pacific theater specifically. Yeah, and what you're hearing now is a retelling of that tension, that conflict, and so let's keep going and see where it goes.
As the American destroyers turned south and slipped back into darkness, their gunfire fading into the distance, another Allied force was closing in from a different direction. The next group sailed under the broader authority of Rear Admiral Karl Doorman of the Royal Netherlands Navy, though technical control in the moment rested with the Dutch captains on the scene. At its core were the light cruisers HNLMS De Ruyter and HNLMS Java, accompanied by Dutch destroyers. These ships carried heavier guns than the American destroyers, but also the symbolic weight of a nation fighting for its last overseas stronghold. By the time the Dutch force approached the strait in the early hours of February 20th, 1942, the Japanese escorts were already on edge. They had just repelled one attack. Their crews were alert, scanning the darkness for new threats. The strait had become a corridor of tension. The Dutch ships advanced carefully, but decisively. Unlike the smaller American destroyers, the cruisers were larger silhouettes against the horizon. Their 6-inch guns, mounted in turrets, offered greater power, but required deliberate handling. In confined waters, with enemy destroyers maneuvering aggressively, Every turn had to be calculated. Lookouts peered into the blackness. The coastline of Bali was somewhere off the port side. The faint glow of activity ashore suggested that the Japanese landing force was consolidating its position. Time was slipping away. Shortly after entering the strait, the Dutch force made contact. At first, it was little more than shapes against an already dark sea. Then came flashes. Japanese destroyers, still patrolling, opened fire. The night exploded once more. This time, the exchange was heavier. The Dutch cruisers brought their main batteries to bear, 6-inch shells thundering across the narrow waters. Muzzle flashes illuminated decks and superstructures in stark white bursts. The concussion of each salvo rolled across the strait, reverberating between Bali and Java. Japanese destroyers responded with speed and precision. They were smaller targets, harder to hit in darkness, and the commanders maneuvered aggressively to close range and unleashed torpedoes. This was the kind of engagement Japanese doctrine emphasized: night, confusion, rapid torpedo attack. Officers on the bridge faced a complex problem. Their ships were more powerful in terms of gunnery, but less nimble. If Japanese destroyers slipped inside effective gun arcs or launched torpedoes from close range, the cruisers could be in grave danger. Reports flowed rapidly. Helmsmen spun their wheels hard over. Massive hulls cutting sharp arcs through the water. The wake fanned out in luminous streaks under the night sky. At one point in the engagement, Japanese torpedoes streaked towards the Dutch formation. The danger was immediate. A single hit from a Japanese Type 93 torpedo could tear open a cruiser's side with catastrophic effect. But luck, or perhaps quick maneuvering, intervened. Torpedoes passed astern or ahead, missing by narrow margins.
Whew.
The Dutch destroyers joined the fray, exchanging fire with their Japanese counterparts at close range. In the chaos of darkness, ships sometimes appeared close, silhouettes emerging suddenly from shadow, guns blazing. One Dutch destroyer sustained significant damage from Japanese gunfire. Shells struck her hull, sending fragments ripping across decks. Fires broke out. Damage control parties moved quickly, fighting flames and tending to wounded shipmates, even as the ship continued to maneuver. The cruisers faced near misses and splinter damage. The shock of exploding shells reverberated through steel hulls. In the engine rooms, crews worked under intense heat, aware that a single torpedo could flood compartments in seconds. The Japanese landing force remained largely out of reach. The transports were already withdrawn or positioned beyond immediate targeting. The primary duel was between escorting destroyers and the attacking cruisers. The confined geography of the Badung Strait amplified every movement. There was little sea room to disengage cleanly. Each turn risked collision or grounding. Navigational precision was as critical as gunnery accuracy. At moments, the battle seemed to dissolve in fleeting encounters. Ships passing on opposite courses, firing broadsides at silhouettes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. And yet, amid the confusion, there were instances of determined courage. Dutch gunners maintained steady fire despite the disorienting flashes and smoke. Damage control teams worked methodically, sealing compartments and keeping their ships in the fight. Officers relayed orders calmly, even as shell splashes rose dangerously close. But as the minutes stretched on, it became clear that decisive results were elusive. The Japanese destroyers, though taking damage, continued to maneuver effectively. They avoided catastrophic hits. Their torpedo attacks, while not immediately successful, forced the Dutch ships into defensive movements that limited their ability to press closer to the anchorage. The balance of the engagement began to shift from attack to survival. With ammunition expenditure mounting and the risk of daylight approaching, and with it the threat of Japanese air attack, Dutch commanders faced a sobering reality. Remaining in the strait would increase the likelihood of losses without guaranteeing disruption of the landing. Reluctantly, the decision was made to withdraw. The Dutch ships turned southward as they exited the confined waters. Behind them, the Japanese escorts held the field. The exchange had been fierce, courageous, and tactically complex, but it had not achieved the primary objective. The Japanese foothold on Bali remained secure. As the battered Allied ships regrouped, in the darkness beyond the strait, the emotional weight of the outcome settled in. They had entered the fight determined to contest the landing. They had faced disciplined opposition and survived torpedo threats in close quarters. They had inflicted some damage, but not enough to change the strategic picture. The Dutch had entered the fight with resolve forged by necessity. They would leave it with a clearer understanding of the challenge ahead. In the narrow waters of Bali, the Allies had discovered that boldness alone would not be enough.
Full marks for the boldness they demonstrated. Trying to fight in a strait alone, I can't emphasize how uneven this battle seemed from the get-go. And yet, the commanders were calm in giving their orders, and danger was all around them, and everybody did their job. It's like, look, focus on your job, do that, and move. Just be proactive. Society in general, not so much. In the age of social media, the fact that we have reaction videos, reactions can be good, but try not to be so swayed by what's happening around you. Be disciplined, be clear, be proactive. I think this is an ethos that we should gravitate to. We should try to have the resolve that it takes, that when trouble comes, we're able to face it with resolve and decisiveness. And also knowing when it's going to be more harmful than good, and they chose to withdraw and regroup, that is an important lesson too. My kids were helping with lawn work the other day, and one of them was horribly sick. He showed up, and he was willing to do it, but he was moving very slow. He looked not great at all. And I had to tell him, hey, you should go to bed. This is not for you. Take care of yourself, because you're just going to make whatever you've got going on worse with very little return. And he did, and NyQuil came to the rescue, and he slept for a very long time. But at some point, trying to be so single-minded and focused in trying to accomplish a task that will ultimately burn you is not wise. I think the Allies showed a lot of wisdom here, a lot of energy.
The night actions in the Badung Strait were not failures of courage. Dutch ships had pressed into confined waters, engaged a prepared enemy, and fought hard under dangerous conditions. And yet the Japanese landing at Bali remained secure. The first factor was fragmentation. The Allied counterattack did not arrive as a single concentrated blow. It came in waves. First, the American destroyers, then the Dutch cruisers and destroyers. Each group fought its own engagement, separated by timing and coordination challenges. This staggered approach diluted potential impact. Had all available ships arrived simultaneously, the Japanese escorts might have faced overwhelming pressure. Instead, they confronted sequential attacks, allowing them to regroup between engagements. Fragmentation reflected the realities of the ABDA command structure. Ships were scattered across multiple ports. Fuel supplies were limited. Mechanical readiness, communication between American and Dutch units required careful coordination, and time was short. Rear Admiral Karl Doorman was attempting to command a multinational fleet under crisis conditions. His authority extended across American, Dutch, British, and Australian vessels. But operational control at the tactical level depended on individual captains making rapid decisions in darkness. Unity of effort existed in principle. In practice, it was fragile. The second factor was technological and doctrinal disparity. By early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had invested heavily in night fighting doctrine. Its destroyer crews trained extensively in coordinated torpedo attacks, conducted at long range and high speed. They emphasized surprise, maneuver, and decisive salvos. Central to this capability was the Type 93 torpedo, a weapon of extraordinary range and explosive power. Powered by oxygen rather than compressed air, it left a less visible wake and could travel far beyond most contemporary torpedoes. Allied commanders did not yet fully appreciate the capabilities of this weapon. The range at which Japanese destroyers could launch posed a threat even before visual contact was firmly established. By contrast, the American destroyers relied on torpedoes that in early 1942 were plagued by serious deficiencies. Depth-keeping problems, unreliable detonators, and performance inconsistencies. On the night of February 19th to 20th, American torpedo salvos failed to achieve confirmed hits. Whether due to evasion, miscalculation, or technical malfunction, the result was the same. The primary offensive punch of the destroyer attack did not land. The American destroyers were forced into gun duels, engagements that exposed them to return fire without delivering decisive damage. The Dutch cruisers faced a different but related challenge. Their 6-inch guns were powerful, but night gunnery in confined waters is inherently difficult. Target identification, range estimation, and fire control all became exponentially more complex when visibility is limited and enemy ships are maneuvering aggressively. Moreover, the cruisers were larger and less maneuverable than the destroyers they faced. Japanese escorts could close rapidly, launch torpedoes, and turn away. The cruisers had to remain constantly alert to torpedo threats, often maneuvering defensively rather than pressing the attack. Geography also played a critical role. The Badung Strait is narrow, with strong tidal currents and limited sea room. Every turn carried risk. Every maneuver had to account not only for enemy ships, but also for coastline, shoals, and the possibility of collision with friendly vessels. For Allied captains unfamiliar with these waters, and operating without detailed reconnaissance, this added a layer of uncertainty. Japanese forces, advancing methodically through the region, had often studied local geography more closely in preparation for landings. Another decisive factor was air power. Even though aircraft were not directly involved in the nighttime surface engagements, the looming threat of daylight shaped Allied decision-making. Japanese land-based aircraft dominated the skies over much of the Netherlands' East Indies. Once the airfield became operational, that dominance would extend even further. Allied commanders knew that remaining in the strait after dawn would invite air attack. Their ships lacked sufficient fighter cover. Damage sustained during nighttime fighting would only increase vulnerability. This reality compressed the timeline. There was no option for a prolonged engagement. The Allies had a narrow window to strike, assess, and withdraw. Finally, there was the broader strategic imbalance. By February 1942, the Japanese forces were operating with initiative and momentum. They chose where and when to land. They selected objectives that extended their air umbrella and isolated Allied positions. Each seizure of an airfield or harbor tightened their grip. The Allies were reacting. They fought where the Japanese advanced. Their operations were shaped by enemy decisions. This dynamic was evident. The Japanese landing had already occurred. Troops were ashore. The airfield was being secured. The Allied attack was an attempt to reverse a fait accompli under adverse conditions. None of this diminishes the professionalism of the Allied sailors who fought that night. They demonstrated aggressiveness and resolve. They engaged a capable enemy, but structural disadvantages, fragmented forces, torpedo deficiencies, geographic constraints, and air inferiority combined to blunt their efforts. The result was not a rout. It was not a collapse. It was something subtler and, in some ways, more sobering. A hard-fought engagement that revealed systemic weakness. In the aftermath of the battle, Allied ships would withdraw, battered but afloat. The Japanese landing force would remain intact. The airfield would soon host aircraft that further threatened Java. The deeper story was one of imbalance, and a coalition learning painfully what modern naval war in the Pacific would demand.
This is one of those early lessons that the Allies had to learn, and it was inevitable. There was no way to avoid this because the military machine of Japan had been spooling up for some time. Like they were well established. They had been conquering territories. They knew what to do. As far as the Dutch and the Americans, I think they trained. I don't know if they were necessarily prepared for this in these numbers so quickly. I have to imagine they weren't, especially in the settings that favored the Japanese. Like, again, with the night fighting, the air power. Hearing the story, it does not sound like there's any kind of aircraft carrier in the vicinity. It's mostly destroyers on the Allied side, correct? Yeah, okay. So what a game changer that ship is, when that shows up, the flexibility that the planes have in attacking multiple vessels, whereas they were having a very difficult time maneuvering so they can get the shots lined up to attack the Japanese, whereas a plane would have infinitely more agility. But the Japanese had that at their disposal. Once the airfield was secure, like you said, it was even more substantial on the side of the Japanese that they could attack at will. I don't like reading stories like this when my side is not doing so great, but it's not a failure. It did get carried forward, and you see that in subsequent battles. One of the main positive aspects of the U.S. Navy is the adaptability that is demonstrated not just through this conflict in World War II, but through the history of the U.S. Navy. That's what they excel at. It stinks to hear this, but you know that, okay, well, what can we learn from this? And that's the right attitude.
As the firing subsided in the early hours of February 20th, 1942, the waters between Bali and Java grew quiet again. Smoke drifted low over the surface. The sharp concussions of naval gunfire gave way to the steady thrum of engines as ships turned away from the strait. For the Allied forces, withdrawal was not dramatic. There was no single moment of collapse. Instead, it was a gradual reduction. It was a gradual recognition that the opportunity to disrupt the Japanese landing had passed. The American destroyers had already disengaged earlier in the night, their torpedo attack unsuccessful, and the ships bearing minor damage from splinters to near misses. They had expended precious torpedoes and ammunition without achieving a decisive blow. Fuel levels and the threat of daylight air attack dictated caution. The Dutch cruisers and destroyers followed, pulling back after their own intense exchange with Japanese escorts. The Dutch destroyer had suffered significant damage from gunfire. Hull plating was torn in places. Fires had been fought and contained. Casualties had occurred. Sailors wounded by fragments. Men thrown to deck by the shock of near misses. Damage control parties had worked methodically throughout the night, shoring bulkheads and keeping pumps running. Even ships that escaped direct hits felt the strain. Machinery had been driven hard during high-speed maneuvers. Ammunition expenditure had been heavy. Crew fatigue was mounting. Many sailors had been at action stations for hours. As Allied ships cleared the strait and headed southwards, there was little illusion about the outcome. The Japanese transports had not been sunk. The landing force in Bali remained intact. Denspar Airfield, already in Japanese hands, would soon begin operating aircraft. From a purely tactical standpoint, the battle had been inconclusive in terms of ship losses. The Japanese destroyers had taken some damage. Allied ships had suffered hits and near misses, but neither side had lost a major warship. Strategically, however, the advantage lay clearly with Japan. By dawn on February 20th, Japanese forces were firmly established on Bali. Engineers continued preparing the airfield for sustained operations. Troops secured key positions inland. The invasion convoy could withdraw with its objective accomplished. For Allied commanders, the implications were immediate and sobering. Aircraft operating from Bali would now threaten eastern Java with greater intensity. Sea lanes between Java and the Lesser Sunda Islands would be under increased surveillance. Any future Allied naval movement in the area would face a growing web of air reconnaissance and attack. Rear Admiral Karl Dorman received reports of the engagement and its results. He had ordered an aggressive counterattack. His ships had responded with determination, but the larger pattern of the campaign was becoming undeniable. The Japanese were advancing methodically, seizing airfields and ports in sequence, each success reinforcing the next. Among the crews, the emotional atmosphere was complex. There was pride in having fought, pride in aggressive maneuvering under fire, in torpedo attacks launched in darkness, and damage control teams that had kept ships afloat. For many sailors, this had been their first true surface engagement against the Imperial Japanese Navy. They had faced the enemy at close range and survived. But there was also frustration. American destroyer crews in particular would later reflect on the failure of their torpedoes to achieve results. They could not understand why their salvos had not produced explosions. The suspicion that something was wrong with the weapons would grow, but in February 1942, it was a bitter fact Dutch sailors carried a heavier emotional burden. Bali was part of the Netherlands East Indies, their home waters, their responsibility. Watching Japanese forces secure another foothold was not an abstract setback. It was a steady erosion of a homeland already under threat. As the damaged ships made their way back towards Java, repair crews prepared to assess and mend what they could. Patches would be welded, ammunition resupplied, fuel replenished. Even that was increasingly scarce. There was little time for rest. The broader campaign was accelerating. Within days, Japanese forces would tighten their grip around Java itself. Landings were imminent. The Allied fleet, already strained, would be called upon again, this time in a larger and more decisive confrontation. In retrospect, the Battle of Badung Strait stands as a warning shot, a preview of the challenges that would cumulate in the Battle of the Java Seas just days later. But in the immediate aftermath, it was simply another night of hard fighting in a campaign defined by retreat. The strait itself returned to its quiet rhythm. Fishing boats would one day pass over those waters, unaware of the tension that had once electrified the night. But in February 1942, it had been a crucible, a confined arena where courage met structural disadvantage. The Allies had struck back. They had not broken the Japanese landing, and as daylight spread across the waters between Bali and Java, the reality became unavoidable. The defense of the Netherlands East Indies was entering its final, most dangerous phase. The ships that withdrew from Badung Strait would soon sail again, into a battle larger, more decisive, and far more catastrophic.
So, this conflict happening in the dead of night, I guess pre-dawn, I think about what the locals must have felt. I'm sure tensions were high, news was being communicated as tensions were escalating throughout the area. Japan was claiming territory after territory, and I'm sure both the governmental officials and the local populace were aware that this was a possibility. And it's the middle of the night. Maybe you're sleeping, maybe you're not, maybe you're wondering about the future. And then in the distance, you hear these huge guns firing, torpedoes being launched and exploding. That's got to be terrifying. Because, I mean, I'm sure just 1 year earlier, you're sailing down the strait with no issue and things are relatively calm and peaceful. And all of a sudden, your homeland is a war zone. That's not something that I've had to experience, but I know there are several that have throughout history. And that's got to be a difficult thing, especially when those that are your protectors, the people that you have allegiance to, have to withdraw and cede to the enemy. I don't know if when the sun rose on Bali and illuminated the ships in the Strait and the invading force, that feeling must have been devastating to the populace. What are they going to do? How long will they be there? Will anybody come save us? What can we do locally to save ourselves? That moment is happening right now in this story. People are trying to figure out what the future holds, and it is very unclear. Not even those fighting. Like you said, fuel is scarce. Getting any material to this side of the world is difficult for, especially like in America or a Britain. Yeah, this is, I guess, the Empire Strikes Back chapter of the battle or the war. And then, yeah, it's rough.
For those aboard the American destroyers, the night of February 19th to 20th, 1942 was a controlled chaos. Many of these sailors were young, some barely out of training and far from home waters. They had heard of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the rapid Japanese advance across the Pacific. They had seen what modern naval warfare could do, and now, in the pitch black between Bali and Java, they were living it. A torpedo officer might have been stationed at the tube, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the mechanical levers and compressed air indicators, knowing that a single miscalculation could mean failure or being hit in return. The uncertainty of the night, the way shadows could be mistaken for ships, for enemy ships, or land for water, made every decision a gamble. Yet the crew moved with discipline, executing procedures practiced in peacetime drills. On the bridge, the captain balanced aggression with caution. Orders had to be issued quickly, repeated down the chain of command, and adapted instantly as enemy contacts appeared and vanished. One misjudged turn could run a ship aground, or worse, place it squarely in the line of a Japanese torpedo spread. The bridge officers relied on lookouts, radar operators, and instinct in equal measure, aware that mistakes could be fatal. For Dutch sailors, the emotional stakes carried an added weight. Many had been born or raised in the Netherlands East Indies. They were defending not just a theater of war, but a homeland under siege. On the decks of HNLMS De Ruyter and HNLMS Java, gunners manned their 6-inch turrets, their fingers steady on triggers, eyes straining in the flashes of gunfire. The noise of exploding shells shook the decks, and the smell of cordite mixed with salt spray, filling every space of the ship. For them, every salvo fired was an attempt to protect the very islands that had nurtured their families. Damage control teams worked in cramped, hot, and dangerous compartments, patching bulkheads and extinguishing fires. Men were burned by steam, cut by jagged metal, bruised by concussions. Yet despite exhaustion and injury, orders were followed with precision. These young men performing extraordinary feats under impossible pressure, fully aware that their actions could mean life or death for themselves and their shipmates. Even in the moments of quiet, the psychological tension was palpable. The unpredictability of the night, the knowledge that a Japanese torpedo could strike from unseen angles, and the awareness of a relentless enemy advancing across the region created a constant undercurrent of fear. But fear did not lead to paralysis. It sharpened focus. It demanded teamwork and trust. Sailors clung to routine and procedure as much for survival as for effectiveness in combat. Among officers, the burden was particularly heavy. They carried responsibility for dozens or even hundreds of lives, making split-second decisions in near-total darkness. Misjudgments were visible immediately. A ship hit, a torpedo evaded, an ally caught in crossfire. Yet they had to maintain calm, projecting authority and confidence to their crews, even while confronting the same fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty themselves. There were small moments of human triumphs amid the chaos. A well-timed maneuver that avoided a torpedo, a gun crew that maintained fire despite smoke and fire alarms, a young sailor relaying orders efficiently under pressure. These instances, invisible in official reports, were crucial to keeping ships in the fight. They represented professionalism, courage, and discipline in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet, the broader reality was grim. Every sailor knew in the quiet moments before action stations that the strategic balance was against them. The Japanese were advancing relentlessly. Air cover was insufficient, and reinforcements were not forthcoming. Their efforts, heroic, might slow the enemy, but could not stop the tide. Still, sailors acted as if they could, and in that determination there was a profound humanity. They faced danger intimately. Each shell that exploded nearby was a reminder of mortality. Each gun fired was a conscious choice to impose cost on the enemy, even when the overall strategic situation was bleak. Courage was measured in decisions, not outcomes. The experience of the night also forged bonds. Crews worked in close quarters. In conditions that would be physically exhausting, trust and cohesion were essential. A misstep by one could endanger many. This reliance on others created a camaraderie that became a source of resilience, a human counterweight to the mechanical chaos of modern warfare. In the aftermath of the battle, as ships withdrew to safer waters, the emotional impact lingered. There was relief at surviving, but also frustration at the inability to achieve the missions. Letters might have to be written to loved ones, reflecting both pride and a raw awareness of danger. Quiet conversations on deck, sharing recollections of near misses and acts of heroism, helped sailors process what they had experienced. The human dimension of Badung Strait reveals something essential about early Pacific War engagements. Battles were not merely exchanges of firepower. They were crucibles of endurance and courage under conditions of near total uncertainty. Sailors operated in a space where technology, geography, and enemy skill intersected to create life or death dilemmas, often in darkness and isolation. The night of February 19th to 20th, 1942 was a lesson in the brutal reality of modern naval warfare. Their actions would not prevent the Japanese from consolidating their foothold on Bali, but they demonstrated a profound commitment to duty. In the larger narrative of the Pacific War, these men exemplified the human face of a campaign often remembered in terms of ships lost and territory seized. The human dimension, the fear, the courage, the relentless focus in darkness, the bonds forged in adversity, is what gives the Battle of Badung Strait. For every ship maneuvered, every torpedo launched, and every gun fired, there were men and women bearing the consequences, shaping history through sheer endurance and resolve. And as survivors withdrew from the strait, their minds already turning to the next confrontation, lessons learned, injuries treated, and ships patched, they knew that the coming days would demand even more of them. The Battle of the Java Sea loomed on the horizon, and with it, the ultimate test of courage, skill, and perseverance for those who remained to defend the Netherlands East Indies.
One thing that stood out, and I don't want to diminish all the things you said, one thing really caught my ear is shown through choices, not outcomes. And that really encapsulates the story you were presenting from an Allied perspective. There were so many things against them. There was a willingness to fight, but just not enough, or maybe not the right ones, or some of them were unproven, like the torpedoes, and through it all, they made the choice to engage, to try to defend their homeland. And very few greater choices and demonstrations of courage, of standing up for your home against Japan was clearly trying to dominate the area. But knowing that there were people that stood up and tried to repel them, that is significant. That does show courage. In fact, I would say it's more courageous when you're on the underdog side of the equation, which these folks certainly were. What a model and example that is for us today, not just from a military perspective, but from a personal choice perspective. that this is one of the reasons I enjoy doing this podcast with you, is because I get to learn not just more about history, U.S. Navy history, but the shining demonstration of perseverance through conflict that is echoed in practically every episode. And even when we honor our fallen heroes at the end of each episode, it's the same. It's like people that are standing up, choosing to do the right thing in spite of the consequences. Incredible.
The survivors of Badung Strait had faced fear, chaos, and the uncertainty of combat. They had fought with courage and skill, yet the outcome of the battle, the Japanese foothold on Bali, was undeniable. As the men looked ahead to the looming confrontation in the Java Sea, it became clear that the significance of Badung Strait extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. It was a battle that left an enduring mark on naval strategy, Allied command, and the memory of those who served. Historically, Badung Strait occupies a particular place as an early example of night combat in the Pacific War. Unlike the open ocean battles that would come later, this engagement highlighted the challenges of confined waters, limited visibility, and the mixed multinational forces operating under extreme pressure. It revealed the deadly effectiveness of Japanese night fighting doctrine and the Type 93 torpedo. Innovations Allied navies still adapting to the realities of modern naval warfare were confronted with a harsh truth. Superior courage and determination alone were insufficient against well-coordinated enemy tactics, especially when technological and doctrinal gaps existed. The battle underscored the vulnerabilities of multinational coalitions operating in crisis. ABDA command struggled with communication, coordination, and standardization. The United States, the Netherlands, Britain, and Australia had their own procedures, equipment, and priorities. In the narrow straits of Bali, this complexity was magnified. Fragmented attacks, uneven training, and differing doctrines limited the coalition's ability to concentrate force effectively. Badung Strait was as much a lesson in human and organizational limitations as it was in the capabilities of steel and gunpowder. From a tactical perspective, the battle highlighted deficiencies in Allied equipment. American destroyer torpedoes failed to achieve significant results. Mechanical unreliability and inadequate range compounded the dangers inherent in night fighting. For Dutch forces, the challenge was not torpedoes, but the difficulty of maneuvering large cruisers in tight, enemy-controlled waters while under threat of torpedoes and gunfire. These lessons, learned at great cost, would inform later operations and eventually lead to improvements in torpedo reliability, radar use, and night fighting tactics. But also carried a profound human dimension, which remains central to its historical significance. The courage displayed by sailors, officers, and gunners offers a lens through which to understand the early Pacific War. And the experience gained in leadership, damage control, navigation, and small unit coordination was invaluable. Beyond strategy and technology, the battle demonstrated the role of human endurance and resilience in shaping outcomes, even when strategic circumstances were grim. The sailor's willingness to engage, often with limited hope of success, embodies a form of naval heroism understated in most histories, but essential to the story of Allied resistance in 1942. Strategically, Badung Strait marked a step in the inexorable Japanese advancement towards Java. While the battle did not stop the invasion, it delayed consolidation of Japanese forces and inflicted minor losses. In a campaign defined by speed and momentum, even small disruptions mattered. The Allies' aggressive response, although insufficient to reverse events, forced the Japanese to remain alert and cautious, consuming time and resources. In this sense, the battle exemplified the interplay between technical engagement and operational momentum, a dynamic that would reoccur throughout the Pacific theater. The legacy of Badung Strait also lies in its influence on later Allied thought. The difficulties faced Fragmented forces, limited intelligence, air inferiority, technological shortcomings prompted reassessments of command structures, training, and doctrine. Naval officers would study the battle, analyzing how night attacks could succeed or fail, how coordination between ships could be improved, and how multinational operations could have been made more effective under pressure. These reflections contributed to the evolution of Allied tactics that, by mid-1942, would begin to change Japanese dominance more effectively. Culturally and symbolically, Badung Strait resonates as a story of determination against overwhelming odds. The battle represents the human cost of defending a far-flung colonial territory, the courage of sailors operating under extreme stress, and the broader struggle of smaller powers facing a militarily superior adversary. Dutch forces defending their homeland's last stronghold imbued the engagement with a sense of national purpose. American sailors, many facing combat for the first time, learned lessons that would shape the U.S. Navy's approach in the months ahead. The engagement stands as a reminder that even in defeat or inconclusive actions, there are moments of profound courage, technical skill, and professional excellence. The Battle of Badung Strait illustrates the early patterns of the Pacific War. Japan's combination of rapid operational tempo, coordinated air and naval forces, and technical innovation created situations where Allied forces were often reacting under duress. The battle serves as a microcosm of these dynamics, showing how initiative, preparation, and doctrinal rigor can multiply the effectiveness of a smaller numerical force, while highlighting the challenges for an opposing coalition struggling to integrate diverse capabilities. Today, the battle is studied not only for its tactical lessons, but also for its human and moral dimensions. Historians and naval analysts examine Badung Strait to understand decision-making under uncertainty, leadership under pressure, and the ethical dimensions of command in life and death situations. Survivor accounts and official reports provide insight into the daily experiences of sailors, prolonged combat, and the psychological impact of facing an inevitable defeat. These perspectives enrich our understanding of naval history by emphasizing the human cost of strategic and operational decisions. Finally, Badung Strait's significance endures because it's part of the continuum leading to the Battle of the Java Sea. It foreshadowed challenges the Allies would confront: coordination across multinational forces, vulnerability to Japanese torpedoes, limited air cover, and the need for rapid decision-making under uncertainty. Lessons learned in these confined waters informed the preparation, planning, and execution of subsequent actions, even if they could not prevent the eventual collapse of Allied naval resistance in the Netherlands East Indies. In the end, the legacy of Badung Strait is multifaceted. It is a story of courage, determination, and human endurance. It is a cautionary tale about technological, doctrinal, and organizational gaps in wartime. It is a strategic footnote in a campaign defined by speed and momentum. And it is a reminder that history is not only shaped by outcomes, but by the decisions, actions, and resilience of the individuals who confront danger. Though the Strait returned to quiet after the guns fell silent, its significance reverberates through the history of the Pacific War, a testament to the courage of those who fought, the lessons learned under fire, and the enduring human story at the heart of naval warfare. The Battle of Badung Strait may have been brief, but its lessons, its human stories, and its strategic implications echo far beyond that night in February of 1942, offering insights into both the nature of early Pacific War combat and the character of the sailors who faced it.
It's nice to know that this particular contest was studied directly after by Allied naval officials. Every defeat is a lesson, and if learned properly, it can be a tool in your toolbox to help lead you to victory. And that's exactly what happened here. When you're facing an enemy that's so powerful and had such momentum, they were just taking over so many different areas and able to hold on to them fairly well. I think when I look at Indonesia generally. That's so many islands and so difficult to capture and then maintain, because it seems like attacks could come from so many different areas, but Japan had developed this methodology to be successful in that. And it was the Allies that had to study the other side of the coin. It's like, well, how do we do that? How do we capture these points? How do we hold them? And then how do we use them to catapult the next series of attacks and later what would be called the island hopping campaign? I love these stories. It brings a close-up view of the individual battles that either won or lost or contributed to the winning or losing of the overall conflict. And just because somebody is up a lot early on doesn't mean they're going to stay there. If your opponent has the resolve, the will, and the adaptability to keep going, then they will ultimately win. Like I said, this is one of the best reasons for me to be here, so I get to learn all this stuff. And so thank you for joining us on this time informational. You are now like the officers of the U.S. Navy in that you get to hear about this conflict and study it and understand what mistakes were made and what could have been done better. Of course, they have a few more details.
We're going to end the episode here honoring one of our fallen angels. Today we want to honor Private First Class Charles N. DeGlopper. His hometown was Grand Island, New York. Served with the U.S. Army, Company C, 325th Glider Infantry, 82nd Airborne Division. He received the Medal of Honor, Bronze Star, and Purple Heart. His date of sacrifice was June 9th, 1944, killed in action near the Murderet River at La Fière, France. He was 22. Born in Grand Island, New York on November 30th, 1921, Charles DeGlopper attended one-room schoolhouse and graduated from Tonawanda High School. In November of 1942, DeGlopper joined the U.S. Army and trained at Camp Croft, South Carolina, assigned to the 82nd Airborne's 325th Glider Infantry. He was sent overseas to the European theater of World War II in April of 1943. There, he and his company served in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France. In early June of 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, then Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, prepared his force of more than 73,000 Americans for an invasion of Normandy, determined to push back against Nazi Germany's occupation of France. Eisenhower said, quote, "You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade, towards which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you." 3 days into the D-Day invasion, DeGlopper landed behind enemy lines near the river at La Fière, France. Cut off from their regiment, his platoon was outnumbered by Nazi soldiers and pinned down behind a hedgerow. To give his platoon a chance to escape, Private First Class DeGlopper jumped into the middle of the road and took a stand with a heavy automatic rifle. Deliberately drawing enemy fire on himself, even after being shot twice, DeGlopper continued to fire on German positions until his platoon escaped to a more advantageous position. Charlie DeGlopper lost his life while drawing enemy fire away from his platoon. For his selfless actions, DeGlopper was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. His citation reads, "The President of the United States, in the name of the Congress, takes pleasure in presenting the Medal of Honor to Private First Class Charles N. DeGlopper, United States Army, for services set forth in the following citation. He was a member of Company C, 325th Glider Infantry, on 9 June 1944, advancing with the forward platoon to secure a bridgehead across the Murderet River at La Fière, France. At dawn, the platoon had penetrated an outer line of machine guns and riflemen, but in doing so, had become cut off from the rest of the company. Vastly superior forces began a decimation of the stricken unit and put in motion a flanking maneuver, which would have completely exposed the American platoon in a shallow roadside ditch where it had taken cover. Detecting this danger, Private First Class DeGlopper volunteered to support his comrades by fire from his automatic rifle while they attempted to withdraw through a break in a hedgerow 40 yards to the rear. Scoring a concentration of enemy automatic weapons and rifle fire, he walked from the ditch onto the road in full view of the Germans and sprayed the hostile positions with fire. He was wounded, but he continued firing. Struck again, he started to fall, and yet his determination did not be broken. Kneeling in the roadway, weakened by his wounds, he leveled his weapon against the enemy and fired burst after burst until killed outright. He was successful in drawing the enemy action away from his fellow soldiers, who continued the fight from a more advantageous position and established the first bridgehead over the river. In the area where he made his intrepid stand, his comrades later found the ground strewn with dead Germans and many machine guns and automatic weapons which he had knocked out of action. Private First Class de Glopper's gallant sacrifice and unflinching heroism while facing unsurmountable odds were in great measure responsible for a highly important tactical victory in the Normandy campaign. Among the memorials to Charles de Glopper are a monument in France not far from the spot where he fell. De Glopper had a dedicated exhibit in the Airborne Museum in France. The de Glopper Air Assault School at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was named in his honor, though the school was later closed due to staffing and funding shortfalls. The U.S. Army Reserve Training Center in Tonawanda was renamed the Charles de Glopper Center in 1958. In 1962, American Legion Post 1346 dedicated Charles de Glopper's Park on Grand Island Boulevard. In 1965, VFW Post 9249 in Grand Island, New York, changed its names to the Charles N. de Glopper Memorial VFW Post. Private First Class de Glopper's courageous stand is depicted by sculptor Susan Gessler's bronze statue dedicated on June 5th, 2021 at the Charles N. de Glopper Memorial in Grand Island, New York. So, Private First Class Charles N. de Glopper, we thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Christoph, get us out of here.
Thank you so much, everyone listening, for joining us. I hope you learned something. I learn something every time. I'm very satisfied, but I hope you are as well. And if you want to get a hold of us, maybe you are Dutch and you grew up in the Dutch East Indies. Of course, it probably gained independence in 1945. So anyway, maybe you're from Indonesia and you know all about this story. Let us know. You can email us at usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. We are also on X Twitter, so if you want to @ us, you can @ us at USN History Pod. And then we also have a Discord server in the show notes. Go ahead and click on that, join up, and talk about this or any other episode. And then additionally, if you want to rate and review, that's very beneficial for us. But you don't have to do it on the internet. You could just tell a friend or a family member, coworker, classmate, cellmate, manager, child. Maybe like, hey, you like ships. They're talking all about conflicts and ships all the time. And they'll join along and learn stuff too. So anyway, thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
And with that, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Goodbye.
Bye.